This is a special Bar Crawl radio report on the recent vigil in St. Mary's, Georgia, in support of the Kings Bay Plowshare 7. Recently, Becky and I were in Central California visiting her mom and brother. At the same time, the Kings Bay Plowshare 7 were at a hearing in Brunswick, Georgia, to decide how they would be allowed to argue their case in federal court. A year ago, April, at night, these 7 men and women cut through a fence and entered the Kings Bay Naval Base in St. Mary, Georgia, a submarine base that houses U.S. Trident nuclear missiles. These are the war-making machines that are capable of destroying whole countries. Carrying hammers and baby bottles with their own blood, these 7 attempted to call attention to the dangers of nuclear weaponry. While sitting at Becky's brother's dinner table, we first talked with 3 Catholic worker activists who were standing vigil at the gates of the Kings Bay Naval Base. We then spoke with 4 of the Kings Bay Plowshare defendants who were out on bail. The other 3 have been in federal prison for over a year. Each of these men and women faced the possibility of a 25-year sentence in a federal prison. First, we talked with Kathy Kelly while she stood outside the naval base with 80 others protesting U.S. nuclear buildup. Hello, hello.
Hello, Kathy Kelly here. Sorry, I was doing another interview right then.
Yes, I was just talking with Anthony Donovan, and he saw you being interviewed by a local media person. We're on the phone here with Kathy Kelly, pacifist and a person who's been arrested for her views on nuclear disarmament. And we talked to Kathy back in Bar Crawl Radio number 32, and you are now in Georgia, near St. Mary's, I believe, at the Kings Bay Naval Base. Is that right?
That's right. We're at the Stimson Gate, which is the entrance to the Kings Bay Nuclear Naval Station.
Right. And could you just describe a bit about what you see around you, in front of you? What's going on there?
Well, on every corner, very fine activists are standing with signs, and these signs say things like "Disarm Trident," and Anthony Eden is holding a sign that says "Kings Bay Plowshares for a Nuclear Weapon-Free World," and Gilberto Zamora, who is a Buddhist monk, is chanting and drumming, and there are several people who are taking video footage or doing radio interviews. There's somebody here from the National Catholic Reporter, and it's in a way a kind of a familial gathering. People have worked for several months to help it happen, but I think that the main draw, the magnetic core to all of this, is the defendants who will be going into court tomorrow morning.
Yes, and I do want to get your some feedback from you on the Kings Bay Plowshare 7. But before we do that, are there any national media out there at this time?
No, the National Catholic Reporter, but other than that, I don't see any national media. You know, there's a great deal of fear down here in Brunswick and St. Mary's and Kingsland, Georgia. So many jobs are connected to the base. And it doesn't surprise me that the national media doesn't nibble at this. And yet, it doesn't lessen our responsibility to try to help people understand that every single one of those Trident nuclear submarines carries explosive potential of 1,825 Hiroshima blasts.
And I'm glad you mentioned Hiroshima. Yesterday was the anniversary of, I believe, the 74th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima by the U.S. military. What's the significance of that anniversary and this protest?
Well, on August 6th today, we began our fast. Those of the 88 people who have gathered, 30 are fasting for the 4 days. And at 8:15 in the morning in Hiroshima in 1945, that's when the bomb was dropped. And it certainly caused so much suffering and bereavement and agony and death and bloodshed. So it's important for us to recall that day and also to recognize that nuclear proliferation has continued apace. and that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King spoke of a demonic suction tube. And when you think of the resources, the science, the ingenuity, the funds that have gone into the development of our nuclear arms, it certainly has caused many people to be without food and without clothing and without housing because what they needed couldn't be met. Instead, we chose, United States people now with our $750 billion military budget, we annually, regularly choose the weapons and wars over meeting human needs.
So let's look at that a little bit. You've just kind of put together two interesting issues. One is hunger, and the other is nuclear war. Is there a relationship there? I heard you making a kind of a relationship between the two ideas.
Well, yes, I think about President Dwight Eisenhower, who, he presided over the biggest arsenal buildup in the world in history. But he did say before he left office not only to beware the unwarranted influence of the military industrial complex, but he also said every gun made, every rocket fired, every warship launched is a theft against those who are hungry and don't have food. He saw it, and it's something that is so very, very real in our world today. And I think that's part of the reason why all across the United States and all around the world, people take time on August 6th and again on August 9th to commemorate those who were killed in Hiroshima.
Yeah, I mean, I remember as a child learning about Hiroshima and thinking that, oh, wow, what a great thing that was, that it ended World War II. And, otherwise those bad, mean Japanese were going to continue to fight. And, thank God, excuse my use of that word, for bombing. And I think the attitude towards Hiroshima has changed over the decades. Do you believe that's the case?
I think that there's been very serious scholarship that has questioned whether or not the intent of the bombing of Hiroshima was to end the war or, in fact, to gain an upper hand over other countries all around the world, particularly Russia.
The U.S. is now actually extending the life of these country killers, these Trident missiles, enormously powerful missiles. Is protest going to be helping in any way to assuage this, to stop it?
Well, I think, for instance, the treaty that was not ratified yet, but signed in New York City at the United Nations has been the result of a very determined protest and hard work that's gone on for years. And the fruit of that really is something that can now be made manifest in lots of other settings and contexts. Anthony will be able to speak much more to this issue, but what I'm thinking about is the legislative proposal now before the New York legislature, which would prohibit any kind of business or commercial transaction or research at a university related to nuclear weapons. And that's the kind of very grassroots, step-by-step procedure, which I think is also very, very necessary. And I think that the action that the Kings Bay 7 Plowshares took helps to galvanize that kind of spirit and courage and determination.
Have you been in contact at all with the local residents of St. Mary's? And how do they feel about it? I know they work at the base, a lot of them, but what is their feeling?
Well, it's so interesting. Last summer, a number of us walked from Savannah, Georgia to Kings Bay, Georgia. And when we started out in Savannah, there were thumbs up and honks and waves. And, at least we were considered tolerable, I think. But the closer we got to the base, the less inclined people were to wave or acknowledge. There was just a sense of almost, the no room at the inn kind of. And so we couldn't find housing for anyone. We stayed out in the state park when we got closer to the base. But this year it's been so different. the hard work of local organizers resulted in 8 households opening up their doors and saying, yes, stay with us. We still have quite a few people out at the state park, but I've noticed a big difference. And for instance, a Unitarian Universalist church invited the 4 defendants that are out on, wearing leg irons but have been out to come and talk. And I know that the organizer for that talk, who attended the church, said the social justice guy at the church was really nervous, like what's going to happen. But afterward, he sent a very appreciative note and said what courage the 4 who spoke with them have. And, you couldn't find 4 people who've used their adult lives more effectively to work toward alleviating poverty and alleviating suffering and promoting hospitality than these 7. They're just people who have lived remarkably beautiful lives. And that shines through. When you talk with them, you get a sense of authenticity of people who are very, very genuine. So I hope before a jury of their peers,
Yeah.
it will be possible for people to recognize that they do have the possibility to find them, to declare them innocent. I've been at these trials, similar trials in Ireland and in England, and seen defendants acquitted on all counts because they were able to use the necessity defense. But the U.S. courts are structured to prohibit usage of the necessity defense. They can't talk about why they did what they did to prevent a greater harm. But we would wish that they'd at least be able to say that they were acting in accord with their religious beliefs. President Trump was only too happy to see passage of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And these are very devout Catholic workers. And Liz McAllister, a very, very devoted anti-nuclear activist and civil rights activist, and very much a Catholic in her tradition. So, it has raised a lot of very, very interesting questions, social questions, but also legal questions.
Right, and there will be a hearing held later in the week. I think I heard you say Martha Hennessy and Carmen Trotta, and the other 2 who are out on bail for their actions in entering the naval base back in April of last year. Were speaking recently at a local church.
That's right. Martha and Carmen were joined by Patrick O'Neill and Clare Grady.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's possible to see interviews with them in various kinds of YouTubes. And I know that they, each of them have done their homework. They've understood a lot about the legislative issues regarding the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and they know a great deal about the terrible consequences of nuclear weapon production and potential nuclear weapon use. But I think what I hope comes through, because they aren't, likely to toot their own horns, is that these are people who have, through their commitment to the Catholic worker, made beds, cooked meals, swept floors, counseled, sat next to people who are among some of the most broken and sort of rejected people in the world. And they haven't done it, just for a summer. They've done it for decades. And likewise inside of prison. Right now, Mark Colville, when he writes from inside the prison, he is a quiet, humble man, but I know he is sitting next to prisoners, listening to their fears, listening to their toils and troubles, and offering people comfort. And likewise, Steve Kelly inside the Glynn County Jail is somebody whose authority is very, very quiet and understated. But I'm quite sure that he's somebody who has gained the respect even of the jailers. And then Liz McAllister, her children will be here, all 3 of them, during this time. And what a time to be separated from children and grandchildren as she's in the twilight years of her life. But about once every 2 weeks, I get a postcard from her, and it's always one that clearly states her commitment, but never voices a word of complaint.
Yeah, we had Martha and Carmen on our Barclaw Radio number 46, and I've never met such kind, gentle, open people in my life. And you all, Brian Terrell is like that. You're like that. Um, I saw
Well, and
Carmen.
Brian is here.
O'Brien is there. Okay, I
Yeah.
contacted him and I did. I guess he was busy to get back to me. But I saw Carmen at St. Joseph's house, and he was this summer. He was sweating bullets while he was getting, I guess, dinner ready for his guests. You, it's just an amazing thing to see and a good use of life. I had one more little set of questions I wanted to ask, and the Kings Bay 7 hearing is happening in a day or two. For they had entered the naval base at night, and I wonder if you could describe a bit about what is the security there, because it sounds like it'd be almost impossible to get on the base, but yet they did. So, what kind of security are you seeing there right now?
Well, I'm looking, but I don't see any sign of a police person or a military person at all.
Yeah,
Um, this doesn't mean that I'm not seeing. I am seeing coiled wire, coiled barbed wire, and chain link fencing, and then there's a gate, and every car has to stop there. But it is pretty remarkable that they were able to enter the base, go as far into the base as they did, and this is one of the reasons why I think the base personnel want the courts to punish people who do this. And, they don't, they're all about deterrence. They don't want anyone else to do this. And
yeah,
of course, we're all told to be afraid of the terrorists, be very afraid of the terrorists. Well, we should be terrified by what these nuclear weapons can do to the whole world and environmentally what we're doing um, along with that to our planet. But it's kind of a, a, a fake uh, fear that gets raised, I think, about how much they have to be on guard against terrorists, because this is not the first time that we've seen unarmed people, Catholic workers like the ones you've described, go into the bases and proceed, past quite a few alarm sensors, and nobody does anything.
yeah. It's an amazing story. I mean, I have heard the story of them entering the base and all the things that they were allowed, they're not allowed to do, that they did in protest of the nuclear missile. Do you still have a few minutes?
Sure.
Okay, because I wanted to just ask two brief questions, and one is the argument about the Trident missile is that it's a deterrent for other countries attacking the United States. What do you have to say to that argument?
Well, I think that we should pay very close attention to what is happening right now with the intermediate range nuclear force agreement being kind of ripped up right before our eyes. Right now, China is moving ahead and developing weapons and could potentially deliver those weapons quite far. We've got the United States telling the Saudis, sure, we'll give you permission to develop nuclear energy, even though right now the seven permits have been issued without any consultation, even with the United States government, no involvement of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference people, no involvement of the International Atomic Energy Association. It's just, Trump likes Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Mm,
So on that basis, he's getting the wherewithal to develop nuclear energy that could be transformed into nuclear weaponry. Now imagine in that part of the world, one more country having nuclear weapons. Israel has probably 40 thermonuclear weapons, maybe scores more, and they don't even declare it. And so never has the International Atomic Energy Association held one investigative peek at what the Israelis have. So they have introduced nuclear weapons into the region. And now we are told that Iran is the great threat. That's kind of ironic because that's the one country that was actually in compliance
hmm
with everything that was demanded. The IAEA said, sure, 24/7 potential to investigate what they have. They poured cement down their reactors that would have been possibly creating plutonium. They did it all. And so the United States ratcheted up the economic sanctions and promises to harm and punish civilians even more in a country which, under a very, very, what would we say, autocratic government, uh, the civilians should not be punished for the actions of a government they can't control. But nevertheless, that government has acted honorably in terms of the agreement for what was the Iran United States nuclear agreement that was negotiated under President Obama, which President Trump also destroyed.
Right. You could turn your argument around and say, rather than trying to get rid of all of these dangerous, awful weapons, that we need to build more because there's such dangers out there, and we need to have this deterrent in order to stop, the other countries from attacking us. Yeah.
Well, historically, anytime one country has had the weapon and the other country didn't, that country has used the weapon. And I think the word now is proliferation. Just think about the population of China. It's 5 times the size of our population. You could maybe say they have 5 times the capacity to be brilliant that we have. And all of those brilliant scientists and inventors are being given the go signal by the Chinese government. Go and make weapons as fast as you can. Now, should we feel safer? Wouldn't it make so much more sense to uphold treaties, to extend treaties, to show a willingness on the part of the United States to say, look, we recognize this is a very dangerous road to follow, and we're going to start. I mean, look at the history between Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy. Eventually, even though there was a lot of bluster publicly, in private, those 2 men were exchanging 28-page handwritten letters saying the greatest danger we face is the generals in our own countries.
Yep. Yeah, it's insanity.
And, one of the posters here shows a whale, the right whale, trying to kind of come above the water, and above it is a mushroom cloud. And it's ironic that this is the habitat for the right whale, which is actually a species moving toward extinction for a number of reasons. But having Trident nuclear submarines prowl along the coastline of this being's habitat is yet another sign of how dismissive the militarists are when it comes to preserving their capacity to blow up the world.
Wow. Yeah. You just took my breath away. I'm sorry. What you have a week there at St. Mary's? What else is going to be happening with the protest?
As I say, 30 people are fasting, including 3 people from afar, including a woman imprisoned in a jail, a federal prison in California.
And who's that?
Her name is Michelle West. And it's interesting. She said, please name me. And if the prison finds out she's fasting, they could put her in solitary confinement. There's a rule against that. But she'll be joining us, and also a very good Franciscan sister in Albany, New York, and also in Cali, Colombia. Our dear friend Ken Jones, who's been part of every action, the walk, and the previous fast down here, but this time he's with the Christian Peacemaker teams in Cali, California. Cali, Colombia. Tomorrow, we'll go to the courtroom and vigil in front of the court. And I think, we'll be the biggest gathering Brunswick has seen for a while since they hosted the G8 gathering. And some of our people will be inside the court, especially family members of the defendants. And then on the 8th, we're not sure if there might be more court hearings. If there aren't, we'll go to different spots in Brunswick and continue our vigil. And on the 9th, we'll be back out here in front of the base, and we'll have a sound system. We'll read names of people who died in Hiroshima. We'll read the testimonies of people who were survivors, and we'll then end the fast and the vigil at Crooked River State Park with a communal picnic. Wow. And then we'll head home to continue to do the work.
Exactly. This is Barcrow Radio, talking with Kathy Kelly, an American peace activist, member of the Voices for Creative Nonviolence, and Witness Against Torture. She's traveled all over the world, was in Iraq during the U.S.-Iraq War, Afghanistan, Gaza, many times, been arrested all sorts of times, and we really appreciate Kathy Kelly, for talking to us both while you're in Georgia, and thank you for joining us in New York City for that conversation we had with Brian.
Thank you, Alan and Becky. Great to be with you.
And we'll talk again.
All right. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Alan.
Hey, Anthony. How you doing?
Wow. Good. And now, where are you, Alan? Are you still in Alaska?
No. We're actually visiting with Becky's, my wife's. You met Becky, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah, you met Becky.
Briefly.
Right. When we were in Washington. So we're in Santa Maria, California, visiting with her family.
Oh,
yeah.
God bless.
And we're going to be doing a podcast here at the bar where we used to date. Way before we got married. And then on Friday we travel up to Banff, Canada, and we're going to be walking on a glacier, and we'll be doing another podcast with the guy who's the glacier guide up in Jasper.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but we wanted to get a report on what's going on there at St. Mary's at the U.S. Naval Base.
Yeah, we're right outside the main gate here. Absolutely. And I just want to connect what you're about to do with what we're doing right now.
Great.
I have no idea. I didn't get to hear everything Kathy was saying, but she probably covered everything pretty thoroughly. But I'm so psyched that you're going to be touching base with that glacier. Because we know, just an accident, a single accident or a small exchange of these weapons, it just will set back all our climate goals like immediately. And just to tie it into some...
And you're talking about immediately. You're talking about within seconds.
Well, it might take a couple hours.
Yeah.
Weeks. Yeah, sure. But it will just really set back our climate and harm that glacial you're going to be witnessing it yourself, and I'm really psyched that you're going to be up there. And are you on the coast in California?
Yeah, Santa Maria is it's central California. It's on the coast. Yeah. It's kind of chilly here. Yeah, because we get a lot of sea breeze.
Whales? Can you see whales out there?
I've never seen whales from here. No.
Yeah.
No, but I know there's whales down there, right?
Yes, and up around New York, actually. You can see them up there too. But just to connect with that, we got these submarines in our waters, and we're polluting those waters with radiation from Fukushima and everywhere else. So I just, and if you're by that beautiful coast over there, I just think of all the wondrous creatures on this planet that we're also standing out here for, and including in this vigil. Just the creatures, our animals, our pets, but also these magnificent souls that are endangered. So
it's all connected, right? I mean,
it's all very connected.
Yeah, the nuclear missiles, the Trident missiles, are part of our world, and is it a part of the world that's helping us or not?
Well, I don't see how they're helping us at all. But anyway, that's of course what we've been told for 70 years. But it's really every day it increasingly endangers us greatly.
We're talking with Anthony Donovan. Works for an end to nuclear weapons. He's active in the Catholic Worker Movement and a member of Witness Against Torture when trying to close the prisons in Guantanamo. And I'm sure you're doing a lot more. You're a documentary filmmaker and a physical therapist.
Nurse for many years.
Nurse for many years.
Hospice care right now.
Right.
So I'm going to go across the street right now and get Brian Terrell.
Okay, I will hold on.
Yep, okay, and he's in sight. Brian is just back from being all over the world. Well, thank you. Hang on one second. This is Alan. Hello, Alan.
Hey, Brian. So great to hear from you. I sent you an email, and I didn't hear back from you. I didn't know whether you were going to be there. I guess I should have assumed you were going to be there at the naval base. How you doing?
I'm well, yeah.
You've been traveling, I hear.
Yeah, I was home for 2 weeks. I was at
You're at the farm
in Germany. I was at the farm for 2 weeks, and before that, I was 2 weeks in Germany at the air base at Vigil, where there's U.S. nuclear weapons at a German Luftwaffe base.
So
Uh,
this has been a nuclear weapons protest month or two for you.
oh yeah, in the end of May at Memorial Day, there was a protest in Kansas City. There's the National Nuclear Security Administration has built a new factory, and they're producing the new B-61 bomb. I think it's version 12 is being made there right now. That's the nuclear bomb that's going to replace the ones that are at the shell. And and then in April, I was was at the nuclear test site in Nevada and spent 4 days in jail for being arrested at the nuclear test site there. Oh yeah, I've been.
You've been busy.
Putting on the miles.
Yeah. So how are you feeling about your efforts?
I'll tell you, I'm some people ask how I find the strength to keep going with the activism, but I think it's the activism that gives me the hope and the strength to go on with the rest of my life.
Yeah.
What we're doing here in Kings Bay, it's on the 74th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, and we're at a time when our government is abrogating every treaty that would control nuclear weapons, at a time when we're putting $1 trillion into modernizing and extending the lifespans of our nuclear weapons, making new, more usable nuclear weapons. It's very essential that we be here, places like this, and say no and to speak out, as most Americans don't know any of this is happening. But it's also essential that we do it for ourselves. It's like this is a very solemn day, and it's a very serious event, but it's also a very joyous reunion, and we have to come together and give each other hope and encourage one another. So it's at the same time we're thinking about the worst horrors this planet has seen, and the possibility of in fact, the very imminent likelihood of more. But we're also celebrating that we're still here, that the planet is still going along, and that we still have one another.
Just talking to Anthony Donovan about the relationship between nuclear proliferation and climate change. Becky and I are going up to walk on a glacier next week, and those glaciers are melting, and there's a connection between what you're doing and that climate debacle that we're heading towards.
Yeah, the connection is very, very clear, and I think too. We've talked, we met over the issue about Yemen, and the war that's going on there, which is a genocide, really is the extinction of our species that we fear is already happening there. And the one of the flashpoints right now about nuclear war is between the United States and Iran, which is all about rather than our Department of Energy. The U.S. Department of Energy is spending billions of dollars on designing new nuclear weapons, trillions of dollars, and not doing research on renewable energy. And the reason, one of the main reasons behind all the tension in the Gulf is about with a dwindling supply of fossil fuel rather than finding an alternative. We're going to fight for that last drop of oil. We are willing to risk the fate of the entire planet over squeezing that last bit of oil from the Persian Gulf. So these are all connected, and I'm gratified that more people are realizing these connections.
This is all the same story. I mean, all this stuff, climate change, the growth of nuclear weapons, hunger in the world, strife in Yemen, the bombing of children's buses. Donald Trump. It's all the same thing, and I guess you see the connections.
And I think even employment and the hopes of our kids here in this country. I just saw reading the New York Times on the plane getting here that only 1% of the shoes in the United States are made here. Like more than 80% are made in China. So we're dependent on China for our shoes. We're not making our own shoes.
Yeah.
We're not exporting anything but weapons. And the biggest part of our economy now is private prisons. Is like what kind of hope do our kids coming up have of making a living, just doing honest work, just finding honest things to do with their time and their lives? I was sitting next to two Navy guys coming here to the base on the plane yesterday. Two very, I didn't want to argue with them. They're just beside young idealistic kids. And this is not working at a nuclear subbase is not their dream, but they're young people who just don't have any. What else are they going to do? What else are they going to do? They can't afford to go to college. We don't have shoe factories to work at, or ballpoint pen factories, or any of those things. We're not doing, and we have to have mastery of the sea so that we can have these huge ships, cargo ships carrying containers of things from China that we could be making here. We need to change everything. The kind of change the world has to make. And the United States has to be first, because we've been leading in all the bad things.
You are a Catholic, a learned Catholic, and a member of the Catholic worker movement. Is there an answer? And this is a big question, Brian. I know that, but is there an answer within the Catholic worker movement that can bring all of these threads together and create a narrative that can move us forward?
Wow, that's hard. Well, I think
maybe you can work on it.
Yeah, well, half the time, I was 2 weeks in Europe and then protesting nuclear weapons there. Then I was 2 weeks on the farm, tending goats and making cheese and
delicious cheese, which you've shared with Becky and I.
And picking the okra and cutting the lawn and all this is. I think that's a part of what the Catholic worker is about, is not just protesting the wars and not just feeding and housing the people who are displaced by a screwed up economy. And by saying just, I'm not diminishing it or saying that it's any less, but also it's. I think the idea of the farm is looking toward a time when people are growing their own food and making their own clothes and doing the things, or doing that in small communities and not dependent on enslaving an entire planet. When peace breaks out, when people in places like Honduras are able to decide what they're going to do for a living and how they're going to use their land, and not be saddled with debt. When people in China are able to not have to work in sweatshops so we can have our sheep shed at Walmart, we're going to have to be doing a lot of that stuff ourselves, and either personally or within small communities. We can't keep going the way we're going, and so the farm side of the Catholic worker is to try to. Again, in a piecemeal and insufficient and not enough way, we're trying to find an alternative.
Can I posit a possible answer to that? It's a looking.
Please, thank you.
I'd love to hear you speak. But it's an attempt. It's a movement to attempt to make lives that are worth living.
Yes.
Yes,
thank you.
We're talking about those two young military naval cadets or whatever, and what is their lives going to be living on a Trident nuclear base? You know, what is the outcome of their energies? You know, and what is the outcome of your energy in living on a farm? You know, and this idea of a life worth living. So anyway, that. I mean, I've listened to you for over a year now, and I think I've learned something about this idea of giving yourself over to a cause, and why you do it. You know, even if people aren't all listening to it, and maybe the narrative will get out there eventually. I hope it does, and BCR Radio is going to do its little part about putting the story out there.
Well, I thank you for that.
And I thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again. We're talking to Brian Terrell. He's a peace activist, a pacifist, a member of Voice of Creative Nonviolence, of Witness Against Torture, trying to get the Guantanamo prison base closed, a farmer in Malloy, Iowa. And we've talked to you several times, and it's been a great pleasure meeting you and being with you, Brian.
Always, thank you.
And we'll continue the conversation. The next day, we spoke with 4 of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7. The day before, they had argued in the federal court in Brunswick, Georgia, that the case be dropped based on RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which requires the government to prove a compelling state interest if it restricts a person's free exercise of religious beliefs, a defense successfully used by the religious right. We talked with Carmen Trotta, Martha Hennessy, Clare Grady, and Patrick O'Neill. Why don't we just start with you? You just had a hearing with Judge Lisa Godby Wood, U.S. District Judge of the Southern District of Georgia. Before we get to how that hearing went, how are you all feeling?
Probably all feeling very grateful for the fact that 80 people from around the country came down to be with us and to protest against the nuclear system and remembering the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And I think that's Carmen. Carmen, you're speaking, right?
Yes.
That's Carmen Trotta.
Yes.
Of the New York Catholic Worker.
Extraordinarily grateful for that. A number of the people, I think it was 34, people decided to fast, and I thought that I would decide to fast with them, and I have so far. And so when we left the courtroom and all these folks wanted to greet us, it's a very celebratory moment. And we're going to these various events where there's food constantly on the table.
Right.
So I'm disgruntled that I can't eat.
Yeah.
Right now.
How many of you are fasting?
Maybe 20.
But all four of you are fasting?
35 are fasting.
Wow. And not just in Georgia. They're fasting in other places in the United States also.
Yes.
How long will the fast last?
Till tomorrow afternoon, through the vigil for Nagasaki.
Okay.
Right, because the Hiroshima anniversary was on Monday, and the bombing of Nagasaki is coming up tomorrow, or is it today?
No, tomorrow. But you know what today is?
No.
Today is probably the most important day in terms of the termination of World War II, because on August 8th, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, and that is really what led Japan to collapse.
Not the atomic bomb.
Not the atomic bombs. We had already bombed 67 cities before we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Firebombed 67 cities in Japan. And the great dilemma in Japan, as I understand it, was we had asked for unconditional surrender, and that meant the doing away with the, what do they call him? The emperor. And it was the emperor himself who decided who made it plain that the war needed to come to an end after Russia. Remember, there was a neutrality pact between Russia and Japan, and up until the very end, Japan was going to the Russians to try and get negotiate a better ending to the war. And at the end, Russia basically betrayed them and betrayed the neutrality pact. and they did so, to end the war, obviously,
So,
and they did.
So the narrative that the war ended because of 2 atomic bombs dropped by the U.S. Military is a false narrative.
Yes.
Yeah, I think
That we wanted to establish our hegemony right after World War II, including against Russia.
Yeah. Clare Grady and Patrick O'Neill are with us. Yes.
Yes.
How are you two feeling at this point?
I'm pretty tired. I think it took a lot more out of me emotionally than I was expecting, and maybe the fast is contributing to that. Although I don't have any hunger pangs, but my sense of smell is much better.
That's interesting.
But
a side effect.
But I was very happy that 4 of my children, my first grandchild and my wife were here. They came down from North Carolina and from Atlanta, so we had family. And Claire had all 3 of her sisters and her niece here, and her brother would have been here except he's sick. And so we had a nice gathering of friends. And one of the things that it's been kind of lonely for us here in South Georgia, because we had some court appearances where the 7 of us were there and there were only 4 supporters in the courtroom. So yesterday, I think there was close to 100 people here over the course of the last few days. But there was one gathering where my daughter counted heads and there were 88 people in the room.
My goodness.
So, that was really uplifting for our spirits, because we really needed to have a sense of the greater community being behind us.
Right.
So,
right.
I'm grateful. I'm really grateful for that.
I just want to say that's Patrick O'Neill. He's a North Carolina Catholic worker, and you have. I think I read you have 6 children.
I have 6 daughters, 2 sons.
Wow.
8.
And then grandchildren.
8 and when you hear me say that, you need to be looking at my wife, not me.
Okay.
She did most of the work.
She was pregnant for 6 years and she nursed for 15, so we'll just call her the goddess.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And Claire, how are you?
Hey there.
Hi.
I'm well, thanks be to God. I'm a little tired but just super grateful. And I'm glad that we're not just here for that court date, that we are here, as Carmen and others have said, for the focus on the base, on the weapons, and on our part in dismantling these homicidal weapons and the systems that they enforce and the sort of the seeds that lead to them. And the antidote is definitely community. And we had this most beautiful mass here at the house where we are staying at 711 Union Street. And there were probably about 25 people on the porch. And we had the word and the bread and the wine and blessing and song and sharing. And it just couldn't have been better. I'm over the top grateful. And our co-defendant, Mark Colville, called in from the jail, as he is in the practice of doing, to join us for the daily mass reading. So we put the phone in a bowl, and then we hear from him, and then we pass the phone. Anyway, people talk to him through the phone during that time.
And that's Clare Grady. She's of the Ithaca, New York Catholic worker, and just spoke about Mark Colville, who is from New Haven, Connecticut Catholic worker.
How are they doing, the ones that are in jail, Elizabeth and Mark and Father Stephen? How are they doing?
Liz got to see her 3 children, Frida, Jerry, and Kate, for the first time since Easter of 2018. It was a contact visit, and Liz was over the moon with that. And Mark and Steve, all 3 of them are just remarkable in their stamina and their strength and their joy of what they're going through. And it's just amazing to behold.
Their
we
joy.
have not seen.
Amazing.
Yeah, right.
And we hadn't seen Mark and Steve for a few months until yesterday at the hearing.
Right.
Wow.
And again, Elizabeth, Mark, and Steve are in prison at this point for their action at Kings Bay Naval Base.
Yeah.
If I could just add to that thing, Martha emphasized the joy, which I think is ultimately our duty. Not only duty, but it's a natural outpouring of being in community and being honest and loving. That's what happens and the spirit resides. But my sense of Mark, for instance, as he appeared in court with us before the judge, is that sort of the longer you spend in those hellholes of our jails, the more pissed off you are too. And he wanted to tell the truth about the ugliness and brutality of that system. And it doesn't always look nice when people tell the truth about that. And it was really obvious to me that it was at those places that the judge wanted him to shut up.
Interesting.
Well, so then before you, we want to ask you about what happened yesterday, but I'm curious now, how can you describe to our listeners what it's like for Mark and Father Stevens and Elizabeth?
They're just not allowed contact with their co-defendants. They have no access to a law library. Their contact with any attorneys is very minimal. There's delays in them getting the paperwork to work on their case. And Mark just reiterated that, he has a huge support system compared to his fellow inmates there.
Yep.
So if you get any of his family, any one of them, any visitors that come down, they can come as far as from California. They can come from the other side of the planet, and they're only allowed 15 minutes to sit and meet with them.
And I just want to mention so that people know, if they want to contact Elizabeth McAllister, Mark Colville, or Father Stephen Kelly, if you go on the Kings Bay Plowshare 7 website, there are specific instructions on how to address postcards to them. And I recommend you do that if you want to send your best wishes to them. Yeah.
So what happened yesterday in court?
Well, yesterday was basically an oral argument, a response to the government. We've been using a statute known as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as part of our defense, and it's a fairly, in some ways simple, but in some ways legally complex statute. It's basically saying that the government has to make a determination that if we have sincerely held religious beliefs, that the government must use the least restrictive means to punish us. So since the government used what we would consider the most restrictive means, charging us for 3 felonies from the get-go, we're arguing that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act should be used to dismiss our charges, or at least allow us to use that defense with the jury. So this was a hearing about that. The government has said, no, we're not going to allow that. And that was the decision of a magistrate, because the pretrial motions are handled by a magistrate, but ultimately it's up to the trial judge. So yesterday, we were in court for the first time with Lisa Wood, the federal district court judge, who was going to be our trial judge if this case goes to trial. But she makes the ultimate decision on whether to dismiss our charges or offer some other accommodation, or say, I agree with the magistrate, I'm going to set a trial date. So yesterday, the 7 of us and the government kind of went back and forth on the elements of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the judge gave both sides only 90 minutes, which was easily enough for the prosecution, because they just had to do a few minutes to sort of reiterate that they agree with the magistrate's decision.
Yeah.
And we didn't have enough time, really. I think Father Steve would have spoke if we'd had more time, but he ceded his time to a lawyer who was making legal arguments. Carmen and I and Claire, although I think Claire did a good job of maintaining her composure, I felt a little bit out of sorts, and I was reading too fast and cutting a bunch of things out, and that was because the judge put a lot of pressure on us. So, but even though I think we had a good presence in the courtroom, I felt like, I don't know how anyone else feels.
And so is the judge deliberating?
Well, she's given us another week, and she's given the government another week to file anything we want, basically, that contributes to the case, which is an indication that she's not made up her mind yet. If she's asking for more information, she's still pondering. And understand something, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act has been often used by very conservative groups, not always, but it's been mostly in civil cases and administrative cases. So we're applying it to a felony case, which is not unprecedented, but highly unusual. And so the lawyer, Vern Walker from New York City, who's been helping us, he's our Religious Freedom Restoration Act expert. He's very optimistic that this judge that this judge is going to make an accommodation, although we don't know what it is. But he also thinks that she's probably feels like that our case has just dragged on too long and that she'd like to get it over with. So it's going to be interesting to see how fast she can respond, because she's going to have to put the final version of the rejection, or, well, especially if it's a rejection, she's going to have to put the final version in her writing, and she can certainly borrow things from the magistrate's writing and just affirm them. But we're just waiting for her decision, and she's going to be obviously thinking it through, reading over things. There's already, I think, for an estimated 500 pages of transcripts and motions and friends of court offerings. So it's quite a complex case now that it's dragged on for so long. So we're waiting. After next week, we have one more week of a deadline to submit more documents and more for our defense, and then it's in her hands, and we just have to wait.
This has been going on now for 15 months. You all have been under house arrest with those ankle bracelets on for 15 months now, and finally you got assigned to a U.S. District Judge. That's Lisa Godbe Wood. And I'm sure the 3 hours that you were there, you were looking at her face and must have been noticing her moods. And I mean, did you get anything from her as to the hope that maybe she's going to give a positive, ruling?
Do you want to answer that question? We've been told that she's by some of our lawyers that this is the brightest woman, the brightest person they've ever met, and she was extraordinary. That she runs a tight ship, and that seems quite true. Running a tight ship is almost an understatement. Mm-hmm. You're a very, very controlling force over the process. She confronted two of our lawyers immediately, interrupted them as they were speaking, and began to ask them questions. And Bill Quigley and Stephanie McDonald were both sort of up to it and did a sort of interesting dance with her on the legal questions. But she was, she was on the offensive sort of throughout. And she's quite a force in the courtroom. I wanted to mention also, which Patrick, I'm almost surprised that he didn't mention it, because she had faced a trial as a federal district judge, which the legislation was related to and very like RFRA, and she was overturned on appeal, and no one would want that to happen. It's a big stain on their career. So it does seem to us that she is also, this very fine mind is to really go to work to produce a document that will assure that she does not get overturned on appeal. Because we use the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, we were able to call expert witnesses, including a theologian and a bishop, to support the fact that we have sincerely held religious beliefs. And the court did agree. They said that our actions were actions by 7 people with sincerely held religious beliefs, that our actions were prophetic, sacramental, and she called it prophetic. He called it, the magistrate, prophetic, sacramental, symbolic denuclearization, that we engaged in that. And a lot of times in Plowshare actions, the prosecution wants to just say, these people are a bunch of religious zealots who took the law into their own hands. That's not what this court said. This U.S. magistrate who wrote this opinion, that's his words. I'm using his words. Right. So it's quite a remarkable and unprecedented thing to have happened in Plowshare history.
So if your argument is supported and RFRA becomes more powerful in the sense of your movement, does that then allow you then to continue with your protests in this way?
That's a good question.
Speak about what makes it for Plowshares.
Well, that's a disputed issue in the community.
Yeah, and I guess we're jumping the gun here because I'm sorry to use the word gun. We're jumping ahead here, and that maybe we should see what happens. But
my question still stands. What if it goes against you? Will it narrow your ability to?
Will it lead?
It would keep us it would largely, I think, keep us in the box that the Plowshares movement has ended up in the past. That the government would basically reduce
the trial to whether or not we entered the base illegally, whether or not we cut the fence, whether or not we threw blood here. And those would be the only things we could speak to. We wouldn't be able to speak to the power of the nuclear weapons, the likely, being 2 minutes to midnight once again, the international relations that are making a nuclear exchange more and more possible, the toxic effects of nuclear weapons, and even their production. So all those things would be off the charts. The only thing is, did we do all those things that we openly admit to have doing?
Right.
Because we believe that the weapon systems are illegal.
Right.
We believe that it's we who are upholding the law.
Right. And if that was the case, you'd be found guilty, I assume, because you did all those things.
Well, I mean, if you can get it, so if we're able to speak directly to a jury of our peers, and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act used as an affirmative defense would help that,
yes,
then it may very well be that we would be acquitted by a jury, or that we would get a hung jury. Yes.
Yeah.
That's our great hope. The hope in that is that people become aware more and more of the nuclear system, and that there are other trials at which this can be used, and by juries themselves, the word would come down that the weapons are illegal, and people would begin to understand that.
Yeah.
So if she dismisses, you won't get a trial.
Yeah.
So you won't get an
That's
opportunity to make to discuss what you want to discuss in court. So
I'm sorry, I missed your name.
I'm Rebecca.
Becky?
Becky.
Rebecca.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
This is
Clare.
I appreciate your question. Yeah, this is Claire. So in a sense, even though we've not had a jury with our peers, this last year has been quite a lot of time in court with affidavits and evidentiary hearings and arguments. That is, I think when we made the decision to pursue this RFRA motion, that we understood that this was opening space that typically hasn't been open in these trials before, or these cases before. So we still see it, or at least I do. I shouldn't speak for other people, but I think we all agreed. All 7 of us agreed to go forward with this RFRA, the motion with RFRA, and knowing that it might lead to dismissal of charges and no trial.
Okay.
But presumably all of this conversation has been valuable for not just the courts and possible precedent in regards to RFRA and religious practitioners of nonviolent and symbolic disarmament, but also for each of us in knowing, there were several things that came up for me. I know you're trying to get what is the outcome here and what are the implications is where I see your question.
Yes.
So is that right, Becky?
Yes, I'm blundering through that question, yes.
Yes, no, you weren't blundering through it at all. It's complicated, and no, it was not a problem from you, but just to help you on our attempt to help you understand. There could indeed be, if the judge says, this is, I'm not going to dismiss the charges, and then writes her decision with bad case law and bad arguments, then she will likely be sent to the 11th Circuit for appeal. And then she runs the risk of being overturned on appeal. And that overturning in the 11th Circuit appeal, that will become precedent for future action. Right? So if you don't go to the appeal and it just disappears because she dismisses us, I'm not sure. That might be a green light for people to act in the same way we did, but I'm not sure where that goes in terms of precedent in a court, in the appeals court. And I don't know if that makes any sense to you. I used to not understand this myself. I always thought if you get an acquittal, that's the best thing, and I still think that's a great thing. But if you get you get a conviction overturned on an appeal with an argument that supports your action, then that opinion actually gets more mileage legally.
That's interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
No,
Then it gets cited in future cases. It legally gets cited, and your defendants you as defendants get to say, well, in case of Jackie Allen versus U.S. government, it says here that you should be allowed to present this and this and this argument, and so that trial has more possibilities.
It's a precedent
in the future.
And that's
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Well, it's what was tricky for me as I was trying to understand this in my youth was an appeal. It has another value that sends a message sort of to the people. So while it doesn't stand up in court and it can't be cited in a future trial by defendants, it has tremendous energy. It energizes people when you get an acquittal. But I think maybe I had some final remarks if I haven't utterly confused you at this point. And that is that the three things that come up for me are, one, educating ourselves as to what's going on with these weapons in our name, right? And that's ongoing work that everybody can do. Two, understanding what our possibilities and obligations are as citizens and Christians of conscience to withdraw our consent from that deadly system that's killing in our name every day. And three, then is sort of like what these legal arguments and the legal landscape that we can navigate to possibly keep the door open for future actions legally. But everything anyone does ever that's truthful and honest and loving is paving the way for the next thing to happen behind it.
You went out for this action on the Kings Bay Naval Base on Martin Luther King Day back in April in 2018, and you carried two banners. One was a statement by Martin Luther King. It said, "The ultimate logic of racism is genocide." The ultimate logic of racism is genocide. I just want to let that sink in. That's racism, genocide. But then you also came up with the ultimate logic of the Trident missile is omnicide, the end of humankind. But not only that, but it's the humankind killing itself. You want to get that message out, but the recent Democratic debates, nothing was said about nuclear disarmament, as far as I remember, or very little about it, and it certainly didn't get the news. How do you get this debate started? How do we start this narrative into the imagination of the American people?
This is Martha. I thought I saw one reference that nuclear weapons were briefly brought up in one of the debates, but I don't have any information or sightings on that. Mm-hmm. I had read that somewhere, and I didn't read it at that moment. But as far as our voice being raised with this particular action, we're just one part of a very big movement that really is trying to bring on nuclear abolition. And I think this trial, if it is to happen, will certainly, in some of the media circles, give some coverage to the issue. But as far as getting it into the presidential debates, that's a really good question.
There isn't anybody running for president of this country who doesn't believe in nuclear weapons or the military. I mean, you don't run for president on that. I mean, you don't hear Bernie Sanders, who they accuse of being a socialist, talking about nuclear disarmament. And I mean, it's pretty far to the left. So I think that it's a mistake to think that we're going to get any relief from a Democratic president. You know, I'm old enough to remember Jimmy Carter getting elected and all the hopefulness that came with that. And then Bill Clinton getting elected and all the hopefulness with that. And then Barack Obama, who is now, he began the process of $1.2 trillion to upgrade our nuclear arms system over the next 30 years. So putting your hope in the Democrats, I think, is a waste of time. And I wouldn't even, I mean, I think the work that we have to do is in the grassroots. I think we have to lead and then the leaders will follow. I don't think it works the other way around. And you're right. We learned something, just like you said, when we came down here and we thought, well, we're going to open up this criticism of this subbase, you know, that's been here for 35 years and now get people talking about what this thing represents, the evil it represents. And that didn't happen. At least it hasn't happened yet. We have increased our presence there. More activists are involved. So some good things have come out of it. But for the most part, nuclear weapons are inconsequential. One of our best support people, she's a Unitarian She said to me one time when, one of the gatherings over the last year, she said, and this is a woman who works on a lot of progressive issues. She says, nuclear weapons just aren't on my radar. I don't even think about them until you guys came here. Yep. So the point is, we have to make people not become completely comfortable with this idea that mutually assured destruction, the U.S. policy with regard to nuclear weapons, means that these weapons are just props and they'll never be used. As we talk right now, there are people in the Pentagon sitting around tables talking too, and they're planning the end of the world, and that's the problem.
Yes, and it sounds like science fiction. The Kubrick film about the bomb, but it's real.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, that's absolutely real. So I think we should remember that we have a fairly controlled media in the United States, and there does need to be a lot of teaching going on. Recently, I wish I could remember it more exactly, but it was The Nation magazine that I think put out 10 questions for the people running for president, and that had to do with nuclear weapons. And never once did they come up with the notion, they didn't suggest at all that nuclear abolition could ever be on the table, as though they themselves, a progressive magazine like The Nation, themselves cannot seem to think of the possibility of nuclear abolition. I also think that most Americans do not know the degree to which, since the G.W. Bush administration, the United States has surrounded Russia via NATO, and NATO states being brought on. We have very closely surrounded Russia. We're putting missile defense systems up on the borders, and those missiles that are in the missile defense system, the great problem with that is that Russia has every good reason to believe that those missiles are nuclear-armed missiles. So we have provoked a new Cold War quite deliberately, or so it seems. And then when you look at the upgrades in our weapons, so Hans Christensen, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, he had an article not that long ago saying that, listen, 10 years ago, 20% of the weapons on the Trident submarine could hit hard targets in Russia. Now, today, 10 years later, he says the figure is now 100%. So the upgrading of weapons is itself a gross violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but no one seems to care.
Yep.
No one even seems to know about it.
Yep.
So those are some of the motivating factors, I think, that would get people charged up.
This is Martha. My son and daughter are 42 and 37, and they really have not heard in their lifetimes enough about the nuclear arsenal. And I think that we have a whole generation of young people who just don't have that awareness that we had in the 1980s. And I think that needs to be dealt with. Climate disruption has a high profile, but nuclear annihilation does not. And, the human mind just keeps turning away from that reality, I'm afraid.
Claire, any ideas?
About how to get this conversation more out there in the dominant culture?
I think so. Changing our imagination, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's what we're doing when we do grassroots action and community building and organizing. And the women and men that are doing organizers down in Brunswick and St. Mary's are making little inroads. But like when Occupy happened and any number of things, it starts with this little group of people, and then poof, like this unexpected moment, things will take off, and you're not really responsible for that moment, but you just kind of keep going at what you're doing. I don't actually have the secret ingredient, but I know that keeping going is an essential ingredient. Yeah.
If any of our listeners wanted to educate themselves, what would you suggest that they do? Are there books to read? Are there websites to go on? What would you suggest?
We carried onto the base Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, and I would highly recommend that. And William Hartung does a lot of writing about the cost of war. And there are lots of books out there to reference.
Okay.
There's a woman named Sister Rosalie Bertell, who's no longer alive, but when she was, she lived and worked as a nun, and her work was partly epidemiology. Anyway, she did studies after 3 Mile Island, for instance, about the contamination of radioactivity. And the industry tried to kill her by running her off the road, and her order sent her to Canada. But she wrote a book. She published 2 books that I'm aware of, and one is called No Immediate Danger, and the other is called The Late Planet Earth. And in No Immediate Danger, which I think was published in the 80s, and it starts off talking about Peru and the places where uranium is mined. And she puts her study of the nuclear beast in the context of colonization. So I would really encourage listeners to also look at that piece, that all the mining, refining, testing, and dumping of radioactive material happens on indigenous lands, and it happens here in Turtle Island and around the world, but also that these weapons very clearly are part of the colonial, it's not just an experiment, enforced colonization, right? And you can't do what you will without having the biggest gun, and we wield it with impunity. So reading Rosalie Bertell is one of my suggestions, and knowing that there are other organizing efforts, like indigenous organizers in the Southwest. They call themselves Nuclear Issues Study Group, and they had a conference that they held in New Mexico in December of 2017 called Dismantling the Nuclear Beast, and you can YouTube that. There's hours of testimonials and presentations that those organizers put on from grassroots organizers. And also in the Haudenosaunee territory where I live in New York, Seneca women have been organizing for cleanup of the nuclear dumping up in Seneca territory, and you can get into that too. Here's Carmen.
I think in line with Claire in terms of best case news source for nuclear waste in particular is the Nukewatch site, www.nukewatch.org. I think people would also do well to learn more about the Treaty for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons and to get on their website also. And I should mention that their tactics, they use a lot of international law, and again, they are of the mind that the weapons are themselves illegal. You should know also that there has been a bit of something of an uptick, I think, in nuclear activity in Germany right now. There are people who've been cutting on to the Buchel air base there, where the United States gives Germany 20 nuclear weapons. And so for 20 weeks, 1 week for every nuclear weapon, they're having people who are cutting onto the base and going into the base as a form of protest and trying to get trials themselves. I should also say that in the 4 countries where the United States has nuclear weapons over in Europe, all of those countries, there are very high levels of dissent as regards the population, not actually dissent, but they don't want the country to possess the nuclear weapons. In every country, it is well over 60%.
So it may not be making the big time media news, but there is a rumble going on, and you all are definitely a big part of it.
So we need to fan those flames.
And I want to just emphasize that we can't, and I kind of agree with you, can't depend on our politicians, or even our liberal politicians, to kind of carry the word. It needs to come from kind of down under. Claire just said that you're tilling the ground of this for this conversation. I think it's kind of wonderful that you, as Plowshares, are tilling the ground. I think that was a wonderful kind of metaphor that you used. I don't know if you used it on purpose, but I heard it. We are Bar Crawl Radio, and we are talking with Martha Hennessy, Carmen Trotta, Clare Grady, Patrick O'Neill, all of the Catholic worker who are under house arrest now for an incursion on the Kings Bay Naval Base in protest of the world-killing Trident missiles that are in abundance there at that base down in Georgia. Does anyone have any last comments before we cut off?
I do want to just mention that none of us are any longer under house arrest. It's a little more leeway, and we're all on a curfew. And in court, it did seem that Judge Wood was suggesting that we could submit to get some relief for that. And so some of us are a little hopeful that we'll be coming off the ankle monitors. Patrick wanted to say something.
Yeah.
I think there's an area that is really, really being ignored, not just by mainstream media, but even progressive media. And that's the role that the military plays in global warming and its carbon footprint. And the military is very, very secretive about their carbon footprint. They don't want us to know that they're the number one user of petroleum in the United States. That probably means the world. And so, I'm coming to the conclusion from talking to people about this and reading about it that we can't stop global warming unless we disarm. And I think that's how we can connect the two issues. We won't stop global warming unless we disarm. And that's something people have to understand, that militarism and global warming are one and the same thing.
We want to thank you all for joining us for this conversation. And I hope, Martha and Carmen, you are in New York, and we'll get you again. And Claire and Patrick, if you're ever there and we get you all together, I think we could have a very interesting conversation at a bar over some beer and whatever.
I think it'd be great. I think if we could put it together, we could set a date, and maybe these folks, maybe Claire and maybe they would come. Maybe they would travel.
Yeah, we would look forward to that.
I don't eat beer. We drink ice cream. I mean,
we can make that happen.
No, we can make anything happen. I was even thinking maybe finding a local theater that we could set up and do it there. But a bar would be even better, I think.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Claire and Patrick and Martha and Carmen.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm gonna drop by the St. Mary's house and the St. Joseph house, right? Down in the Bowery.
Mary House, St. Joseph.
St. Joseph House, down in the Bowery where you two work. I was down there once and Carmen was sweating bullets getting dinner ready for everybody. It was a hot summer day and it was like you were just working. I have to get down there and help you out. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you. Safe travels home.
Good luck. Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye-bye. Blessings. Oh.